All right, and we're recording. Hello, everyone, again. Dr. Larry Chapp here with another one of my webinar interviews. This time around, we've got, again, Dr. Matthew Meinert and Dr. Matthew Levering. We're also going to be joined by Dr. Richard DeClue this time around. DeClue, excuse me. Geez, I got Meinert right, and then I goofed up Richard's name. We'll start. Dr. Richard DeClue is the Cardinal de Lubac Fellow at the Word on Fire Institute with my good buddy Bishop Robert Barron. And we're happy to have him here tonight. And joining us again is Dr. Matthew Levering, who teaches theology at the University of St. Mary of the Lake, otherwise known as Mundelein Seminary, which is outside of Chicago. And Dr. Matthew Meinert, as I said, and he teaches philosophy and moral theology at the Byzantine Catholic Seminary of St. Cyril and Methodius. And if memory serves, Matthew, that is outside of Pittsburgh, right?
In Pittsburgh, technically.
Oh, it is actually
in Allegheny. It used to be Allegheny, but now it is Pittsburgh. So.
Oh, okay, very good. So it is actually technically in Pittsburgh. All right. So I'm going to start with a prayer. I always like to start with a Hail Mary. In the name of the Father and the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Our Lady, seat of wisdom, pray for us. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for being here tonight. It is evening for all of us. I'm going to start with Dr. Richard DeClue, because we did not speak with him last time, and then we can just have a free-flowing conversation from here. And feel free, all three of you, to interrupt me and ask each other questions, and because I envision this not so much me sort of interviewing everybody as having a free-flowing conversation, although if there's all kinds of dead space, I will interject something. So we'll go from there. Okay, so Dr. DeClue, you are the Cardinal de Lubac Fellow at the Word on Fire Institute. Maybe you could begin first by telling us, how did that come about? How did you become the de Lubac Fellow at Word on Fire Institute?
Well, I was actually finishing my doctoral dissertation corrections and selling luxury vehicles, including Porsches.
Wow.
And I had just put some of my work out on the internet, on YouTube and on a blog, and some people at Word on Fire saw some of my work, and initially they just wanted me to ask to see if I was interested in just being a conversation partner with Bishop Barron, which of course I was. And then they found out what I was doing, and they were like, well, we actually have a position if you want to apply for it. So I applied for the position and eventually went through the process of, being interviewed and stuff, and was hired. And then it wasn't until after I was hired that they decided on the name of the fellowship. So the fellowship received its name later. But yeah, that's
very exciting. It's amazing to me how many irons in the fire Bishop Barron has and Word on Fire has. It's just every time you turn around, there's some new wing of Word on Fire that's getting started out there. And I know for some people, it's a little off-putting. It's like Bishop Barron is taking over the world because he's everywhere. But I think it's great. That's because I love what they do at Word on Fire, and I love Bishop Barron. But anyway, I was interviewed by Bishop Barron out at the Santa Barbara studio last summer. Bishop Barron Presents, I think, was the name of the show. Anyway, in the midst of that conversation, both Bishop Barron and I said, that neither one of us were Rahnerians, and that we were somewhat critical of Rahner because we were force-fed Rahner. Both of us were same age in the seminary during the sort of heyday of Rahner, and that we had both discovered Balthasar and the Ressourcement thinkers, and we both had a sort of rebellion against Rahner to a certain extent. And I remember that, in an emails correspondence that I had with you, you sent me some really interesting things where you said, hey, look, Rahner has essentially gotten a bit of a bum rap. And I was wondering, maybe we could lead off this conversation because I don't talk a lot about Ronner in my blog and these interviews, and a lot of the circles I move in don't talk about Ronner very much. It's like he's this completely forgotten figure anymore, even though he is truly one of the giants of 20th century Catholic theology. So maybe you could share with the viewers what it is that you think Ronner brings to the table and why he's still relevant to us today.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I will preface it with this. I'm not 100% convinced that he actually needs to be read by people today. So it's going to sound like a little bit of an interesting caveat, but partly because in order to understand his actual own personal thought, it's difficult because you can't really rely on people that claim to be Ronarians, because a lot of Ronarians go off in a crazy direction that even Ronner himself would have thought was absurd. So
Right.
I think that's one reason he's becoming more and more irrelevant, is just because his own followers have gone off the deep end. No, I guess, so what spurned that email correspondence with you is just the fact that for whatever reason, I had a lot of Ronner studies as an undergrad, as well as in early graduate school. So I had studied Ronner's Spirit in the World, which was his failed doctoral dissertation in philosophy, based on a question in the Summa about whether or not the intellect can know anything without first converting to the phantasm. So it was my professor, who was pretty Thomistic, was just convinced that Ronner had found the solution to respond to the critiques of Kant while avoiding the negative sides of Marischal. Now, I still don't know what he meant with all of that, because I've studied philosophy, but I'm not a philosopher. He was just enthusiastically convinced that Ronner got it right. What I mean is that I think Ronner gets unfairly painted as this extremely progressive liberal, because I don't think he actually was. I think he's much more conservative than a lot of people think. And yes, I think his dissertation is one hint in that direction, because you think about it, he was studying philosophy in Germany under Heidegger. And he chooses to write a doctoral dissertation in philosophy, trying to protect and maintain and support a Thomistic metaphysics of knowledge against the Kantian critique. Now, people can argue, and philosophers would be better at doing this than I would, about how well he succeeds in doing that, and because he obviously is. And he's not just repeating Thomas. He's basing himself on Aquinas and trying to take seriously the critiques and respond to them, so that we don't have to throw out real metaphysics of knowledge. I just think that says something, about his personal bent. His also, I think, in many ways, his theological method is in some sense very scholastic, in the sense it's a speculative philosophical theology.
Yes.
So very different than like the likes of Ratzinger. I think I've always been allergic, and me and Dr. Miner have talked about this a lot. We're both very allergic to strawman fallacies and misrepresentations of people, and I just got tired of it's the same thing with the Lubach, where I see people calling them modernists and things all the time, where people would say, "Oh, anonymous Christian, oh, that's terrible, you don't need missionary activity, blah blah blah." I'm like, but he addresses all of that, and he really doesn't say anything different than Lumen Gentium. So it's like people don't actually take the time to understand what his actual point was. And because I had studied him a lot, both in philosophy and in theology as an undergrad, and then at Boston College my first year before I went to CUA, I think I just had a different experience of the different side of Ronner than a lot of people assume. Because most of what people seem to think about Ronner was based on what they heard people say about Ronner. or because they heard Ronarians and rightly thought Ronarians were crazy and assumed, well, they must have got it from Ron. That doesn't mean I wholeheartedly endorse all of his theology and all of his positions, but I think he personally was a little bit more conservative than is often thought.
Yeah, it was brought to my attention, for example, just the other day by somebody, a guy in Australia who's doing research on Ronner and Marichal and these guys, who pointed out that Ronner was not a big fan at all of the Novus Ordo or some of the liturgical reforms, which I thought, well, that sort of flies in the face of the image of Karl Ronner as this, this big-time liberal. It reminds me, I mean, I got my doctorate at Fordham University in the late 80s, early 90s is when I was doing my coursework there before I did my dissertation. And it was dominated by what my friend Dr. Bill Portier, Matt Levering knows Bill Portier, and my friend Bill Portier refers to it as the American Ronerian trajectory, or ART. And what it is you start with Ronner and then you drift off, as you just pointed out, Richard, in rather liberal, progressive, and sometimes just downright crazy directions. And then this becomes identified with Ronerianism. And when I was at Fordham, this is what I encountered. This is what I experienced. And it became very, very clear to me. I mean, there was just this hegemony of Ronerian thought when I was at Fordham. I mean, to such an extent that I suffered resistance to doing a dissertation on Balthasar, because Balthasar was considered just a right-wing troglodyte back in those days. My, how times have changed. And so I developed this strategy, and then I don't want to talk about myself, but it goes to your point. I developed this strategy. I just started poring over Ronner's writings, especially in theological investigations, and I started writing all of these papers showing how deeply Thomistic in so many ways Ronner was, how deeply traditional in so many ways Ronner was, and I would quote Ronner liberally. And there really wasn't a whole lot that my professors at Fordham could do to undercut me, because I was using Ronner to combat their version of Ronner. So I think you're absolutely right. I think Ronner has suffered at the hands of his epigons, and that's kind of sad. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to either one of them. Let's start with Matthew Levering. Do you have any thoughts on Ronner, Matthew?
Well, I like the attitude here. I mean, it's I see that Ronner was a real genius, that's for sure. And I mean, the problem is that I'm going to come across as sounding like just another guy talking about Ronner. In other words, I think what Richard was saying is you guys both were saying you got to read Ronner. Yeah. And so I would direct readers, first of all, to his book from 1972 called "The Shape of the Church to Come," which actually honestly, it's one of those complex books where you have to kind of parse each paragraph. And then I'd also advise people to read yesterday's History of Dogma and Theology for Tomorrow. That's an important essay that he wrote around the same time period. But so again, I think there's a lot of trouble with Ronner. He's after the council. I think he's a leader in the in what really is liberal Catholicism, and that some of that is present earlier. But of course, he's a great Jesuit mind in the sense of incredibly well trained, and I've been reading a lot of Ronner in the past 5 years and treat him also in this. Also his moral theology is also important. But so I'm not a big enthusiast, but I do really respect people who say you got to actually read Ronner. That seems fair.
Yeah. I don't think anybody in this webinar would be designated a Ronner enthusiast. That's for sure. I have issues with his Christology, his soteriology. I think his soteriology is a little bit weak. And his Christology and Trinitarian theology, I think, are a little problematic. So, yeah, I have I mean, I am, after all, a Balthasarian and not a Rahnerian, and there are distinct differences between Balthasar and Rahner on those matters. Matthew Meinert, what do you think? And then we'll move on.
Yeah, it's just funny this comes up because Richard and I have had this conversation in the background, and I've often thought, what would Matthew Levering think if he heard these? Because in Matthew Levering and I's emails, there's a constant theme that Matthew beats home, and I think rightly so. He speaks of, sort of the danger of the Rahnerians, and keep your eye on the fact of the echo and the echoes thereof, right? There's a sense in which, Rahnerianism has now passed over into whatever the full force progressivism is today. And I wholly agree with him on that. But I had such a kind of convertive experience, at least of affect, when I was translating Jean-Hervé Nicolas' Synthèse dogmatique, especially the big volume, just because of how placidly he would face up to texts of Rahner, especially on some stuff in Trinitarian theology, a little bit in Christology, especially, kind of the picayune scholastic things about Christ's knowledge sorts of things. So not the big global things in Rahner, it's sort of an essay level reading.
Right.
And then also in issues of grace. So like I was in the middle of translating Nicola, and I was teaching a course on St. Gregory Palamas and Uncreated Grace. And I used the Uncreated Grace essay by Rahner. And as a Thomist, there is some real wrong-headed readings of certain epistemological things. So I just was furious, to be honest, right? But I also, of course, I saw all the erudition of the interaction with the scholastic conversations about the indwelling of the Trinity, and I was very struck by that. Well, then at the exact same time, I'm translating Nicola responding to that essay in Rahner, and there's such a just even keel that Nicola had in responding to it, kind of trying to give it its due while having to kind of whole cloth critique the use. He basically says something like, as for its interpretation of Thomist epistemology as applied to this issue, it's useless. Now, that might seem a little strong, but it's a little bit like and then I'll finish, my reaction to Skilebex's Christ the Encounter, or Christ's Sacrament of the Encounter with God, or whatever. That in a way left an imprint on me that, once again, Nicola and in his own way, even Cardinal Journet, take lines from that kind of sacramental read of the church more in a like the way that Skilebex would have taken it than someone like Zemmelroth. And while I'm by far no Skilebexian, like there's at least a part of me this is a weird part of me that's going to get me killed by the traditionalists, but the part that wants to give a respect to Garrigou and the forgotten Garrigou. It's like, don't forget that there was a tragic set of moments where these figures were not quite what they became in 74 or later. Now, not that there weren't there earlier, right? But there's just a part of me that says one has to at least interact with them at that level to see them kind of full humans, right? As full humans.
Yeah.
Garrigou is a pain of a conservative, but he's also more than that. And it's there was at least a period where it's like these men were of such a character that people like Ratzinger thought they could be in line with them until they had to part ways. So there's a part of me trying to understand the human dimension while also just recognizing, I think, Matthew's concerns about in the end where it goes. I do affirm that as well. So
yeah. So I guess, Matthew Levering, you're saying, and I think I agree with you to an extent, and then going along with what Matthew Meinert just said, there is a sort of early Rahner, mid Rahner, late Rahner, and maybe the late mid to late Rahner is not so far away from the liberal and progressive interpretation of him. Is that, would that be your view, Matthew Levering?
Oh yeah, that's the case. Yeah, but he's Rahner's a complex man. He's a genius, and so you always benefit from reading Karl Rahner. He's profoundly intelligent. I mean, just to read his essays on any topic, really does introduce you not only to a whole set of theological debates that it's important to know about, but also he's got valuable things to say, and then another point is that he's so amazingly gifted at rhetorically that he's does a kind of like a model in certain ways for how to spread one's ideas. So I have a lot of respect for Rahner, but I do think, yes, he is a driver of liberal Catholicism after the council. He's an important figure. He's neglected. People think of liberal Catholicism as sort of driven by Skilbeeks and others, but Rahner is an important driver of liberal Catholicism, by which I mean classical liberalism. Rahner drives that after the council, and he does it from within the Jesuit order. Mm-hmm. And De Lubac knew that. De Lubac wasn't pleased.
Neither was Balthasar, and neither was Ratzinger. Yeah. Go ahead, somebody.
Yeah, just one tiny remark there too. Inside the order, as you said, or within the society, I have a student who, I know a student, is what I'll just say, who's over at the Greg, and I couldn't believe that there were all these Rahnerian echoes in some syllabus he sent me. I thought that left such a deep mark on how they still sort of structure the course texts even to this day and the topics. Yeah. And it makes me remember, take Matthew Levering's words in those emails seriously.
I don't remember what I said. I don't remember.
Well, you're just always harping on the Rahnerians, and I tend not to think of them because in the Byzantine East, no one's talking about Rahner. So,
oh man.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if I would. Rahnerians. A lot of the people that I know who, you got to remember, Theological Investigations is out of print. It's not in print, and so people are not. A lot of people are not reading Rahner. So I'm not sure I would even classify, people as Rahnerians right now. They just haven't. A lot of the younger generation just hasn't even read Rahner.
Wait a minute. Wait. I am blissfully unaware and ignorant. Thank you for enlightening me that Theological Investigations is out of print. I find that, because I've got so many of them, and I didn't know that. That's kind of shocking, actually.
Yeah, people don't really read Rahner. People don't read him anymore. The younger generation doesn't read him. So I respect people who read Rahner. I just think it's important to read him critically. But so Rahnerians. I don't know that many Rahnerians, and I do. And there's some, like Peter Fritz. He's a Rahnerian who's seems a very fine person and scholar, but so I don't know. I want to talk about Rahnerians, but I would say that Rahner in the 70s was in early 80s was a driver of kind of liberal Catholicism understood in the classical liberal sense.
Well, there's absolutely no doubt of that. Just about every. It was Skilbeck's, Rahner, and a few others, but that was definitely true. Let's shift gears away from Rahner now but I wanted to bring that up because recently I've been rereading Rahner again, basically because Richard sort of pricked my conscience just a little bit because I'm always so anti-Rahner all the time, and I thought, he's onto something here. I remember reading Rahner and in my graduate studies and thinking, there's a lot here. And even though I have major issues with him, I concur with you, Matthew Levering, that people should read him. You really should, because he's a genius and he's a significant thinker, even if you disagree with him. But anyway, I'm going to go back to Richard now, the De Lubac Fellow of Word on Fire. I am, because we've got Matthew Meinert here, who's like big time expert on neo-scholastic thought, and I was wondering, Richard, if you could comment and maybe then get into a conversation with the two Matthews here. But what was De Lubac's real historical relationship with the neo-scholastics? Obviously, there was antagonism there. There were personal animosities. Maybe you could just comment a little bit on the whole history of what became known as La Nouvelle Théologie, De Lubac, and their antagonism with the neo-scholastics.
Yeah, I'll do my best. I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is biographical. Obviously, he suffered in World War I. He had that major head injury, but then during World War II, he's having to dodge Nazis looking for him. He's even during his theological studies, the eldest daughter of the church, France, was becoming so anti-Catholic that the Jesuits weren't even allowed to teach in France. And so he had to go to England to do his studies. So one of his own concrete major issues was the secularization of his own home country that used to be a bastion of Catholicism.
Right.
And so he saw this heading towards secularization of society, this radical separation between church and state, to where the state's now even antagonistic to the church, not even just ambivalent. And he goes to study in England. A fellow French Jesuit professor of his asked him to look into Aquinas's own writings on nature and grace to see if the standard neo-scholastic trope was to be found there or not. And that's what sort of sparked his own research into the question. And in his own mind, it's connected with secularization. And so he ends up being concerned that if you emphasize the self-contained, self-sufficiency of nature so much that grace is not needed by nature. So nature doesn't need grace to reach its ends. It's okay, well, maybe it would be nice if it's possible, but it's not really necessary for nature. Then you're sort of providing ammo to the other side. You're providing fodder, philosophical fodder, to your enemies to say, look, we don't need grace, we don't need theology. We can just be a secular society without any of that. And so that's kind of behind his concern. And
right,
you know, he does of course pick up some aspects of Aquinas's thought that are important. I still go back and forth, on who I agree more with, which side of it. I tend to agree with you, Larry, that sometimes his scholarship can be a little bit off, where, and he's not always consistent in some sense on the question, but I appreciate the fact that he's trying to push this notion that, look, nature was created for deification. That's, I think, his biggest insight, is that in the concrete world,
right,
the reason we even exist is because God wants to communicate himself to us. And that is why we're here. And that means something, and we can't just ignore it and act like, nature is the self-sufficient thing that can run on its own terms. That can create other problems, though, where now there's got to be some distinction between nature and grace, nature and supernatural. Otherwise, the terms don't even make sense. So, of course, he's getting pushed back. You're basically questioning a whole, as Dr. Miner pointed out before, 700-year tradition of interpretation and development of Aquinas' thought, and you're coming along and saying, y'all got it all wrong. You're going to get some blowback. And so that kind of did happen, and now don't get me started on the term nouvelle théologie. I just can't stand it, because I think it's a category that lacks any meaning, because it holds together people that are diametrically opposed.
Yeah.
Now, just as a point to ponder, I think in some ways the ressourcement movement was correct in trying to create a space within Catholic theology. I think their concern was that, okay, this neo-Thomism is sort of dominating everything, and it's becoming equated with the Catholic faith to such an extent that you can't do anything else without being called to Rome under suspicion.
Yeah.
So they were saying, hey, the Catholic tradition is very broad and deep. Like, there's other thinkers than just the combinatorial tradition on Thomas that should be allowed to be explored and shouldn't be forgotten, and we should bring them back. How about we, not equate Catholic theology with this one school? But I think it's important to note that doesn't mean that you therefore think that school too should that it shouldn't be reversed. It's not that you're saying that the Neo-Thomist school itself should die or cease and desist. Those aren't the same thing. Saying that we should make room for other schools of thought within the tradition, which is why it's not the same as liberal progressivism, is not the same thing as saying that Neo-Thomism itself is wrong. They weren't saying the Neo-Thomists are heretical and they need to be censored. They weren't. Now, they might disagree with them on certain points, like nature and grace. You have these debates on individual issues. But so while I agree that the Race Horse Mall movement was correct, I don't think it's been good for the church that Neo-Thomism has now become such a small minority that it almost has no impact in most places anymore. So that's not a victory, I don't think. And so if you talk about Racehorse Mall winning at the council, for instance, I don't think it's been a good thing that Garrigou and Labradette and Nicola have been forgotten. I don't think that's been a benefit to the church. So in some sense, in trying to make room for other schools of thought, Bonaventurian or what have you, or more Eastern patristic stuff like that, that I don't think it was really the aim to kick the Neo-Scholastics out of the academy. It was just to augment. Yeah. And unfortunately, it's now, what I see in most universities, it's either all Thomas and nothing else, or almost zero Thomas. And to me, a good faculty should have a lot of Thomas and some other things as well. And then I personally do think that you should, not everyone can do everything. I think we should have good Thomist scholars, that's their work, and they focus and maintain. I want to see the Neo-Thomist scholastic tradition continue on its own terms, alongside some of the other Racehorse Mall. Yeah. So for me, it's like the Neo-Thomists could be part of Racehorse Mall movement. It's not, don't kick them out either.
I think that's, in defense of the Racehorse Mall thinkers, by the way, I hate the term La Nouvelle Théologie as well. I dislike it intensely. And in defense of the Racehorse Mall thinkers, do you really think that it crossed their mind in the slightest, given the historical times in which they lived, that in a very short period of time, Thomism and the Neo-Scholastics were going to be utterly eclipsed in the church by the progressive wing, that they were just going to be largely forgotten and discarded? I think that was probably the furthest possibility from their minds as they were plying their trade and developing other avenues of doing theology. I think they were simply trying to crack this rock open just a bit and find some fissures into which they could pour their theology into what really had, I think you're entirely correct. It had sort of become this sort of hegemonic school of thought. But rather than me waxing eloquent about what do the two Matthews have to say to what Richard just said, let's start with Matthew Meinert.
Marie-Joseph Nicola foresaw that doom. In one of the closing arguments in the Revue Thomise, they really were displeased by not getting answers about the first 10 volumes of Théologie, the series that went alongside Sur Chrétien, as being actually implicitly anti-Neo-Scholastic. And they were quite vexed, saying that basically if this attitude continues, all of the schools should fear that they will not exist. It's not only Thomism, but all the traditional schools will be gone, and nothing that will remain are other than a pastiche of themes that are thrown together after the fact because of the loss of the unity. Now, perhaps that's a bit, hysterical sounding, and it's, sociologically it seems crazy. In 49 or 50, whenever that closing article was written. It was written, actually it was in an article that was responding to LeBlanc, who wrote a defense of Henri Boyard. And I think Matthew's writing a book, I think, on development of doctrine. I think it was very unfortunate that they couldn't have just focused on the whole development of doctrine thing that was underneath Boyard. Because what happened was, in the course of those arguments with Labradette, they kept looking at what Henri Boyard said at the end of his dissertation, which was then published as the first volume in Theologie, and said there are echoes of this in footnotes in Sources Chrétiennes, volumes 1 to 10, and in the Theologie volumes, with a lot of kind words about them. Michel Labradette bends over 6 ways backward to be kind, but he says, in the end, there's a kind of just absolute disdain for the past period now, and we're going to move to the next one. They read that, maybe they read it into it, Richard. They read that in the origin text and the Corpus Mysticum. Like if you read Nicola's review of that, they read that as being part of kind of under the surface of the Lubach's work there too. I think that they were too anti-pluralistic. I get nervous myself, not really as an Easterner, but as a thinker, that they have kind of an idea of theological science, and there is a wink and a nod that's like everything is going to just get kind of metabolized by Thomism, and once it's metabolized by Thomism, we can have a kind of resource small. It is in a Thomistic fashion. Like there is a sense that pluralism is not there. So I really want to say, like, I don't think all of it's correct, but I think that it was a dialogue that got missed. That whole dialogue theologique thing. There was a circling of the wagons that happened, especially the Boyard text. If you guys go back and read the end of that Boyard book, it's sophomoric, what he writes about the development of dogma. And then when he digs his heels in on Trent, that's where I thought the whole thing, that's, to me, the flashpoint more than anything else, is that guy.
You're not wrong about that. And you're the one that turned me on to that. And it is kind of, the Boyard stuff is concerning. And
although I came to it too, let me be very clear here. All glory, laud, and honor on this one to John Kerwin, because Dr. John Kerwin really helped me piece some of this together, and I worked with him. So, I don't want him, I don't want to ever just be jumping out in front of him here. And I'm kind of sensitive. He wants to make sure that the narrative of a book we have coming out with CUA Press is not trickled out too much. But I think it's good to put a couple seeds out there so people bug CUA to move with the publication. But, because I do affirm a lot of the normal concerns about the need to actually have better positive theology and the integration of positive theology into the scholastic method, and then just theological pluralism. I'm more of a pluralist than even most of my masters on this, because I can't not be a pluralist as an Eastern Catholic. I'm called to be a Thomist in the East, but I definitely don't call Easterners to be Thomists in the East. So... yeah,
I have a million thoughts going through my brain right now, because I'm currently doing so much reading on the concept of development of doctrine. My last blog post was obliquely on that topic, although I fear that it too was a bit sophomore. Well, all blogs are sophomoric.
It's a blog. Blog's fine.
Yeah, but I do take what I say seriously in one sense. I don't want to just throw out their theological garbage, even though things have to remain relatively superficial. So, Matthew, you're writing a book on development of doctrine. I was not aware of this.
Well, sort of, Larry, but not really. It's a book. It's a book that's coming out. It's finished now. It's called Newman on Doctrinal Corruption.
Oh, that's
and so it is. It does treat it inevitably treats development of doctrine, but basically the argument is that that Newman you can't take development of doctrine seriously unless you take doctrinal corruption seriously, and at least, and so I do that through a set of five encounters or 5 dialogues that Newman had in his lifetime with other other important thinkers from his time. So anyway, but so it's sort of, yeah.
So the concept of doctrinal corruption is kind of what interests me, because I was sent by David Bentley Hart his latest manuscript. I haven't gotten the book form yet, but he's got a new book out on tradition, and he had originally sent me the PDF form on that, and he's extremely critical of Newman and Blondel, and essentially any semblance of a Catholic concept of an organic development of doctrine. And so one of the points that Hart makes, and other people are making it too, is that in these very Irenic renditions of the development of doctrine as being very organic, one has to overlook the manner in which oftentimes doctrine has actually been corrupted in the history of the Catholic Church. So I would be interested in perhaps you giving some examples, Matthew, of where doctrine has been corrupted in the course of the development of the tradition.
well, Larry, I do think. I mean, it's a topic that is almost too big for our time in a way. But again, I'm glad that you mentioned David Hart's book, though, because I do have 5 pages on David's Hart book. His book, 5 pages. I was able to integrate that right at the last minute. I read the book a couple of days ago and put it in as I was doing the proofs. And yeah, the book though is, I mean, David basically says, look, that the whole notion, it's not really an issue of defending Newmanian development, doctrinal development. The issue is defending any sort of doctrinal continuity, really. David says that, look, Orthodox, Protestants, Catholics are all in the same boat. They're all way overcommitted on doctrine / dogma, and they're all way overcommitted, and there's no real future for that. And so I think David's a different thing. I mean, to my mind, David's Hart, his book really does take you back to Alfred Loisy and others. That's what's really up toward as you get to the other books. That's what's up.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think David knows that. David knows that. He's too wise to. He doesn't want to quote those guys, but David knows that.
Yeah, I think so. And I remember when he first sent me the PDF and I was reading it, I was thinking, wow, this is a throwback, and it's quite radical in its own way. And I don't bring it up to say that I agree with it. In fact, I don't. But to simply point out that overly Irenic, organic renditions of the tradition proceeding forward. This has become a sort of, in other words, it's become a kind of standard technique in Catholic apologetics, right? Catholicism never changes. I mean, this is what Newman was dealing with too, right? Protestantism changes. Catholicism doesn't change. Protestantism teaches errors. Catholicism never teaches error. And that is an apologetical move that I think is fraught with dangers in its own right.
Oh yeah.
And so, for example, and we can get into this, and I don't want to dominate the conversation. As I wrote in my last piece, if you look at, I mean, I'm following Thomas. Are you familiar with Thomas Guarino's book, the Disputed Teachings of the Second Vatican Council? I mean, in there he does a wonderful job of showing the continuities and discontinuities of Vatican II with regard to past doctrinal development. And there were certain things that Vatican II absolutely reversed in terms of development of doctrine. It's not an organic development. It's a development by way of reversal. And so it seems to me that has to be taken into consideration. And and the point that I made in my piece was, is this not the central flaw, then, of the Second Vatican Council? Why, perhaps in some ways, it pastorally failed, in that the council was not more overt as to what it was doing, and did not provide us, therefore, with a hermeneutic as to what it was doing, and just sort of threw these reversals out there and said, there you go, we've developed doctrine, without really giving any hermeneutical apparatus for the church to deal with that. I throw that out. I mean, what do you guys think of that?
Let's let Matthew take that. This just feels like a Matthew Levering question.
Well, and so in that book, Father Tom Guarino, he talks about there's solemn teaching, and and then teaching that hasn't been taught definitively, and so he argues that. And I think this is quite right, that the church can reverse itself on matters that haven't been taught definitively. And of course and anyway, but I think what you're saying, Larry, makes sense. But, I don't know how Vatican II would have done what you're suggesting, though. I don't know that it could have really. Ratzinger later tries. Ratzinger, when he's writing, in his Christmas address from 2005 or whatever, you see what he says there, and so he's giving you the background needed to understand what they were doing. But the truth is that Congar and others had shown that really these type of things are present in all councils in some ways. That there are developments that are leaps, or that are in certain way are breaks with something. I mean, in other words, it was known by theologians prior to the council, but it was something that would have been very difficult to articulate, by the council itself, or at least that's how I see it.
Okay, very good. Matthew Minard, what do you have any thoughts on that?
I want to actually throw a question out, to be honest. I'd like to hear from the others and you guys, because
absolutely, go for it.
We got here last time, but I can't remember if some of it was afterwards, some of it was out here in public. But I mean, I'm firmly as an Easterner attached to the council, because we don't get mistreated by Rome, after in the same way, because the ecclesiastical status of our particular church is not merely in Orientalum Ecclesiarum, but through the whole spread of ecclesiological documents, really articulate a view of the church that thankfully gives a kind of much broader communio sort of ecclesiology that enables us to exist in a way that can be hopeful someday for being orthodox in union with Rome. So hence, I even teach the historical sequence on that, and I've become more and more a very pro-Vatican II guy, which is interesting because I came from traditionalism in the West. I was never a trad, but there is continually, with every meeting I have with people, a growing trad critique. I don't know if you guys saw Michael Pekalik's recent
I did.
On Crisis. I don't know if Matthew read it. I sent it to him as a kind of what do you think about this, Matthew? The essay saying, basically about getting beyond, just put it in the past. It's exhausted itself,
Spent. He said it's spent.
Spent is it? You're right.
Yes. Yeah.
And I see that as just one more mainstreaming of a certain vein of the traditionalist thought here. And I know many people like this who probably would fight me tooth and nail if they knew, my comfort. That doesn't mean I have pretty strong thoughts about the liturgical disaster in the West. Not my fight, though. But that being said, on the whole, it's I'm a man after the council, even though I'm a Garrigou guy. And I just want to throw this out maybe for the other two and for you as well. Just your thoughts on the state of all that in view of sort of where things were drifting. Because of hermeneutics. So there's your hermeneutic.
Yes.
So my hermeneutic,
throw
this around is, I'm kind of research-wise, I want to look at people like Journet and maybe Gagnabe and Parente and some others. They squared the circle, so to speak, and it wasn't a squaring of a circle, but they managed to integrate still their old Thomism with a post-conciliar view, right? So, but that's the kind of searching for a hermeneutic, right? And that is a real issue here. So that's what made me think of it. So, okay, now I'll be quiet.
No, I think I had real issues with the Pekalik essay. I don't think Vatican II is spent, but he raises good points. He says we should have another council to clarify things. I'm not certain now is the right time for that. But anyway, Richard has been sitting up in my top right corner here patiently listening to all of this. Richard, do you have any thoughts on anything that we've just said here? I'd be interested in your thoughts on concepts of development, how they relate to Vatican II, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even know about that other book out there because I'm doing a lot of work on Vatican II right now for Word on Fire, but I've had in the back of my mind a possible book, but more highlighting the continuity with the prior tradition. So I'd be interested to read that book you mentioned to see what reversals he's claiming took place. I do know, to Dr. Minard's point, that, for instance, it was the Eastern Catholic fathers had an impact at the council. And if I'm not mistaken, a lot of their concerns are what led to Dignitatis Humanae on religious liberty, because a lot of their, obviously their homelands, and let's pray for what's going on right now. We're under threat of their governments outlawing Catholicism. And so the notion of religious liberty, and part of the reason it was highlighting that so strongly, was to protect Catholics in atheistic communist regime countries, saying that no, they have no right. So they might be doing it through force and with power, but no real authority. That they're unjust laws. They don't have the right to stop you from practicing your religion. So they're not laws that you have to obey. And people sometimes forget that part of the narrative, that's part of the reason religious liberty is being pushed, because of how it's not maintained in many of the Eastern countries at the time.
Well, that would be one of the reversals that Guarino points out. I mean, that's probably the most significant.
Yeah, I think
reversal.
The reason I struggle with it being a reversal is because I do actually think Thomas Pink is correct in that it basically holds to a Leo XIII understanding of religious liberty. Now, there's a prior question, which is Leo XIII's notion of religious liberty a reversal from prior teaching? But
there's this guy. Hey, there's this guy at St. Meinrad's, a canon lawyer named Michael Dunnigan, but he's gonna be publishing a work on Dignitatis Humanae, which is just amazing. It's unbelievable. And,
really?
And yeah, so keep an eye out for that. It's going to come out from Emmaus Academic, but it really is something. And he doesn't take quite Pink's view either, but it's really, he kind of someone who they had it reviewed by a guy who an expert on the whole thing who agreed with Pink and came out just thinking the book was just absolutely fantastic. So anyway, I think your basic point, Richard, though, what you're saying is just that we gotta be a little careful using the word reversal, because we want to be sure that we're not talking about reversal of things that have been solemnly taught or things that truly belong to the ordinary magisterium, or truly belong to our faith. We don't, and that, I think that's the key point there, is that sometimes people with Dignitatis Humanae, that's what they're always thinking has happened. So I think Richard is onto that, and I don't think there. I think we got to be careful about the word reversal.
I think that folks like Lefebvre and Ottaviani certainly viewed it as a reversal.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very hard to read Mirari Vos and various syllabi of errors put out by 19th century and early 20th century popes and come away with the view that the church wasn't teaching that the concept of religious conscience rights. I mean, Gregory called it in Mirari Vos absurd and erroneous to hold that there's such a thing as universal conscience rights with regard to religion. And yet Vatican II says exactly the opposite. I don't know how to construe that other than as a reversal. And this wasn't Gregory's opinion. This was and what I would say is one can isolate certain points of view along those lines to the more recent, modern magisterium. And I think what Dignitatis was doing was appealing to an older tradition in the church. And I'm not arguing for radical rupture or discontinuity. I'm saying that Vatican II, Dignitatis, was putting things right. And in order to put things right, it had to put certain people in their place. And this is what I mean about, in some ways, there, as Guarino says, there's a masking going on here by Vatican II, a masking. And maybe, I'm going to disagree with all three of you guys here. But I think that Vatican II was pointedly, without being pointed, reversing the teaching of 19th century and early 20th century popes. And now Leo XIII did talk about human dignity, and popes after him started talking more about human dignity. And so obviously Vatican II is developing that line of papal thinking. But I don't know. I would certainly not think that Murari Vos or the teachings of some of these early 20th century, like Pius X, I would not consider those to be irreformable, solemn, dogmatic teachings. Obviously, I wouldn't think that. Otherwise, they can't be reversed. I mean, but anyway, I'm taking up all the time, and that's my view, and I'm going to stick with it. Anybody who wants to come back at me with that now?
What is Larry? Larry, you're going to like Michael Dunnigan's book. I guarantee it.
Oh, okay, great. I can't wait. You can't give me a little tease here, a little spoiler?
When's it coming out?
I don't know. I'll send it to you in PDF, Larry. When we're done. But the thing is that, yeah, of course, what you're saying is, anybody can see the points that you're making. I mean, so that I feel like the issues are too complicated, though. They're too complicated, and the kind of nuances you have to make here are just too complicated to for someone who's not very good at talking like myself to be able to communicate it quickly. But so I'm just putting in a plug for Michael Dunnigan's book. I think you really will like it, definitely.
I'm excited to see that come out because I'd love to read that, and the one that Larry just mentioned.
Yeah. And Father Guarino, I think that also is a very fine book. So I don't have any,
I think.
Larry, just so you know, you're silent.
Your microphone's off.
Yeah, microphone's off or something.
Well, Richard, it's fun to see you and Matthew, and I'm glad that you're a real bridge builder. I know that's our purpose here is to build these kind of bridges that that we love the faith. We really embrace the teachings of the Catechism. So I know that we're here to kind of come together as people who love the faith and love Jesus Christ. I know you're exactly that kind of bridge builder and someone who cares about really drawing upon the resources, whatever good ideas people have had in the past. You're interested. So thank you.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, and I do think it's important, and I'm encouraged by the work you're doing, as well as Dr. Meinert and Dr. Chapp, because I think it's important for someone. I'm more or less, most of my studies have been more in the communio side of things, but that's never made me not appreciate my early Thomistic leanings, and so I feel like a certain responsibility to say to other resource mom people, look, like Garrigou-Lagrange was not the problem with the church. Like he was not
right.
what led to the problems we're having today. And so let's not be overly harsh here. And, in some ways we have suffered from him not continuing to be more prominent. And we need to admit that. Like we could have used the likes of him in his school in helping to fight the liberal progressives that have gone crazy. And then on the other side, I think it's important to have people like Dr. Meinert who are so well steeped in that neo-Thomistic tradition to be able to say, look, those resource mom guys are not all bad.
Yeah, and to be clear, it's like the opposite side then. It's like I'm steeped in that world, but my first readings were Ratzinger. I went crazy for Ratzinger my last year in college. I was a computer science undergrad, but then I did my BA in theology, most of my coursework that last year because I was done with my CS degree. And that was the year he had been elected. So they offered an upper level course on him. And I read 4 or 5 books in it. It's just an undergraduate course. But I just started buying Ratzinger. I got injured in cross country, so I was reading on the elliptical reader. To this day, people make fun of me that I walk and read. I love walking and reading. I did it on the elliptical. And I just kept buying one book after another. I'm a kind of guy who I don't like to have breaks. There's a Platonist in me. I don't like breaks in the chain of being. And so I can't look back to my past and just act as though, I have to cast all this aside because I had some good interaction with Maritain and then Garrigou, right? And, something came up just recently about Saint-Simon of all things. And, because the LA diocese put up the picture of the political scientist Saint Simon for Saint Simon on your Roman calendar. They had the wrong picture. And I thought, I got to read that de Lubac book on him. Because, I remember, I think that actually Labradette says at one point, it was the kind of book that only, it's the only kind of book he could have written, because only he sort of had struggled with all the issues sort of involved. So, I don't get to do as much there just because I keep getting stuck in scholastic-y kind of things, But I know in my heart the positive benefits I derived all the way up through my monastic life and after, even afterwards. And so I just refuse. I refuse to let the other narrative win. So that's probably why in my emails with Matthew, I have a little bit of my pushback goes in a direction, funny enough, even if I chirp at you guys, it's usually in the trad direction, actually. For as much as I chirp about the Communio people having won and they get on their high horse, I do that a lot, Larry, to poor Matthew. That being said, the actual fire that really gets me is usually the trad side, because I say, you guys are going to ruin you're cutting your own noses off. And I just like the fact we can get together, and I hope we can model a kind of Christian fraternity. I mean, we're not together. I wish we had this stein of beer all together, but I think it's important to do that. So.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah, we can. When I talk to Matthew, I talk about that back in 1996. This is what I told Matthew, was referring to this conversation we had on email, and I said there really was no high horse because we were all getting clobbered. Everybody was getting to study Balthasar, and that was who I studied in the 1990s, and really gratefully, to study Balthasar, you would just get clobbered. There was people here and there, but there was no high horse.
That was a good email. It basically read like him putting his hand on my head, and we have a very positive back and forth. But sit down, kid. Let me tell you what it was like. That's how I read that.
90s. Larry knows all about it.
Oh, I do. Because I'm an old man, and now, this is great. My microphone should go off more often, because you guys just had a great conversation without me interjecting my big nose into things. So that was great. That was a good back and forth. And I do look forward to the book that you mentioned, Matthew, coming out, because I'm just voraciously reading right now anything I get my hands on. With regard to dignitatis, but also the broader question in general of the development of doctrine and what it means, what it doesn't mean, what counts as ordinary, extraordinary, authoritative, but not irreformable. I mean, I'm speaking of Rahner. I mean, Rahner clearly held that certain teachings were clearly not irreformable. I mean, a lot of people would hold that. But it's and Matthew Minard mentioned the traditionalists. And the reason why this has been so much on my mind lately is that I think because of the circles that we all move in here, I think we're probably quite a few of us friends with a lot of traditionalists, and you can't be a conservative, quote unquote, Catholic without moving and rubbing shoulders with a fair number of traditionalists, and I know that this question of the development of doctrine is what vexes so many of them, that they just cannot get their mind around the idea that the church can change, that some of its non-high-end, teachings can change. And I think in some ways they've been red-pilled by Pope Francis. And I don't want to get into we're too late into this conversation to get into a whole conversation about Pope Francis. But I think, one of the reasons why in the past 8 years we've seen an explosion of rad-tradism, I think it's that double whammy of not having a proper hermeneutic of when things can change, when they can't. And then along comes Pope Francis, who is busting all kinds of molds. And they Peter Kwasniewski, his book out saying the Pope Francis is a heretic and so on. So it's one of the reasons why I've been writing about it so much. I'm probably getting a lot of things wrong, as I'm just shooting in the dark. But it goes to the point of a kind of, Christian fraternity here. I just don't want to, in anger, write off the rad trads. Mm-hmm. I think there are a lot of people out there that they put voice to. more than we think, and I think this is a deeply felt problem for a lot of people. What do you? Maybe we're kind of running out of time, but I'll start with Matt Levering on that because I know you have to go soon, Matt.
You're right. I mean, there's a lot of pain, a lot of renewal, that people are looking for, and I think what you're saying about development doctrine, that is true, because and that's kind of the point of my book, is that the word development doctrine gets sort of thrown around, and before you know it, it can sort of be applied to almost anything. It's like the rabbit that gets pulled out of the hat, and I'm just trying to say that that's not what it is, but when you do study Catholic history, church history, you can't have you can't have sort of it's almost like studying scripture. It's like scripture. If you're going to be a fundamentalist or some sort of literalist, some sort of then you're not going to really be able to see the density and historical messiness of scripture. And the same thing holds with the doctrinal history of the church. And yet there and yet there's a limit to that, that there really is doctrine and dogma that are solemnly taught and that are consistently held and that belong to our faith. And I think you and I agree, completely.
Yeah. Oh yeah, we do. And I think there is, gosh, that would be a whole other topic for another day. I've been reading William Cavanaugh on this in his book, Field Hospital. He's got a great chapter in there about the pedagogy of the tradition. In many ways mirrors the pedagogy that we see in Scripture. And so I'm glad you made that linkage there between the sort of, the way Scripture does things and the way, because it's a traditioning process, what we see in the Scriptures and what we see in the church's tradition. But anyway, Richard, do you have any last words for us before on this topic or anything else?
Yeah.
Then I'll go to Matthew Minor.
Yeah, just to piggyback on all that, I go to the traditional Latin Mass probably 90% of the time. So I obviously have a lot of connections there. I'll say two things about it. One, I had already, before the Motu Proprio came out, I had already been spending over a year fighting the very things it cites as the reasons for it, because I saw them in that community. I'm not saying in the parish I'm in, where that's not. Our parish has been doing that for over 20 years, and our pastor hasn't put up with a lot of that stuff. But it wasn't wrong insofar as the problematic things it saw in a lot of traditional Latin Mass communities. It's just a fact. But on the other hand, you're right, the radical traditionalists in some sense are being fomented precisely because they have legitimate concerns that are still not being addressed. It's the liturgy that most parishes have is not what Vatican II called for. It's not.
Right. Right.
You still have a lot of priests, high school level, college level professors teaching things that are not compatible with the faith, and they're allowed to do so with impunity. There's been very little. We have Ex Cordia Ecclesiae was a great attempt by Pope John Paul II to try to correct that, but there was no juridical force behind it. Almost no theologian is censured. So and yet, if you're more traditional minded, you're the one that's told to be quiet and shut up. Whereas people who are not faithful to tradition, who openly contradict church teaching, both ordinary and extraordinary teaching, are allowed to just persist unchecked. And so there are legitimate problems. And I think if we're going to try to correct the issues in the Rad Trad movement, well, we also need to take seriously some of their complaints.
Yeah, because a lot of the criticisms they raise are absolutely true. I mean, I personally attend an Anglican ordinariate parish, even though I'm a cradle Catholic, because I prefer the liturgy there to the typical Novus Ordo liturgy that I find in an average Catholic parish. That's not to say they're all banal and beige, but I find most of them to be. So yeah, I mean, the traditionalists do raise some good points. Anyway, Matthew Minor, did you want to weigh in on this topic?
Basically, can just say the last thing Richard, I mean, all of what Richard said really pretty closely echoes my thought, actually. I mean, for all intents and purposes. It's just said in a different way. And I'll just say, I went to the, after I started my paperwork for becoming a Ruthenian, my wife got me the tickets to what I called Trad Fest. So it's it's this thing that's up in Wheeling, West Virginia, or something like that, where they get together. And, truth be told, I expected myself to have a kind of dismissiveness, because I really do it kind of affectively. I'm not a rigid person. I really, scrupulosity ain't my problem. And so that side of tradism gets to me, and it's attendant.
Yeah.
Older trads almost brought tears to my eyes. Michael Matt had some video they played of like his family with the basement masses after Vatican II. And I thought, oh my God, the sort of thing these people suffered in that period, right? Like whatever we can say about how they reacted and what they did, etc. I mean, I got some real problems because I'm also an irenic person, so that's going to bother me. It humanized it for me immensely to imagine you go through a world in which no one gets censured for things they should be censured for. We all know, all four of us in this box know what that's like to think, why is he not in trouble? And I also think the liturgical changes, this is not a denial of the Novus Ordo, etc., but I'm a real believer that, like, if that happened, anything like what happened to the old calendar and the liturgy of the hours and even the structural form of the Roman Rite were to happen in the Byzantine Church, I would potentially go and only move to DC and become a Melkite. And I don't really like the Arab thing at all, because I know that the Melkites would just kick their heels out and not do it. I've heard the Melkites play around with the idea of completely going back to the liturgy of St. James. And I thought, you people are going to do yourselves what the Romans did, with a kind of antiquarianism of sorts in a different way. And I would, if I were a Melkite, I would because of that. So I really deeply understand their concerns with the liturgy, because the liturgy is the living transmission of the tradition. No, it really is. It is theologia prima in a way. And I just really want, as much as I complain about them, I actually really, quite frankly, get that as the point of dissent the most. And I just don't like the attitude that comes with it, because I really can't square the attitude with what St. Paul says in his letters. I mean, St. Paul stands up to, but you know what? He counsels us to be pretty meek on the whole. So, yeah. Yeah,
and when he first converted, Paul, submitted himself to the teaching and to the authority of the apostolic college. I mean, he immediately goes, to be tutored by these fellows. I'm 63 years old. I remember, the silly season, as George Weigel calls it. I mean, I remember, and so I understand the pain that older trads in particular feel. I mean, I was a young man, but I remember 1974 vividly. I went to mass at a Vietnamese parish, and the pastor there was just a white Caucasian American, and he decided one day. I didn't know at first this is what was going on. He was consecrating rice cakes and sake, or attempting to consecrate rice cakes and sake, because he thought that was more, relevant. And I remember how irate the Vietnamese parishioners were. They didn't want rice cakes and sake. First off, nobody in Vietnam eats rice cakes, and sake is not Vietnamese; it's Japanese. Yeah, so think of the subtle racism that's involved there as well. But hey, it's Asian rice cakes and sake. I mean, that's just how stupid so much of it was. Just not just irreverent, just stupid. And anyway, you get the point. So, why don't we've been going now for an hour and 20, so we should probably end there. I thought this was a great conversation. I hope you guys did too. Maybe we didn't cover all the topics that needed to be covered. But thanks for joining me, and maybe we can do this again sometime. So thanks a lot, guys, and thanks for watching, everybody. Hit my little button here.